One is what we call as the Analytics Day, which is in keeping with one of the USPs of our institute, which is the discipline of analytics, which we have incorporated in all the programs. That happens sometime in the second half of the year, around October, November, December. And the budget event happens, obviously, in February or March. This is the third event, as I said, I mentioned earlier, this is the third edition of the budget event. In the first edition, in 2010, it was a panel discussion and involving people from the corporate fraternity as well as the academic fraternity. In the second edition, it was an inter-school competition. And the third edition we have combined, it's a combination of both, having both the eminent speakers from industry to come and address the students, as well as an inter-school competition. So an event like this offers a platform for students to showcase their knowledge of the budget, their knowledge of current affairs, and their skills in analyzing the budget. It also affords them or gives them an opportunity to hear eminent people from industry and academia who are experts in their own way. And that's the objective of this budget. So it's an opportunity for students to showcase their skills as well as to learn from senior members of the academia and corporate fraternity. Now, when we come to the budget, the budget we have, it's about 65 years since independence, and we have had about 65 budgets. But it's only about 10 or 8 or 10 or 11 or 12 budgets, 10 to 12 budgets that have, you can say, notable and which have had some significance. You tend to remember them. The first budget, of course, was in 1947, which was presented by Mr. R.K. Shanmugha. And that was presented in a period of about 7.5 months. They need not have presented the budget. It could have been just an authorization of expenditure. But the government went ahead and decided that we will present the budget. So that was a notable event in its own way, that within 7.5 months of the independence, we presented a budget. The next one was the 1950 budget, which was presented by Mr. John Mathai. And that was notable for the sense, for the fact that the whole concept of planning in India was introduced then. The concept of the Planning Commission and the role of the Planning Commission in India was introduced by Mr. John Mathai in the 1950 budget. Thereafter, we have some budgets which have been, you could call them washouts, you could call them retrograde. I can enumerate 2 or 3 budgets. The 1957 budget of Mr. T.T. Krishnamachari raised the import duty to as high as 400%. And those were the days when we talked about the socialist Raj and the sheltered economy. And the import duty was raised to as high as 400%, which meant it really became a high-cost economy. It also became very difficult to raise external debt. Then we had the 1973 budget of Mr. Y.B. Chavan, in which he nationalized the coal mines. Today in the last few years, you might have been hearing, last few days, for instance, you might have been hearing about the coal scam, and someone has been, the CAG has projected the coal scam figures to be something of the region of 25.7 lakh crores. So, and that, the origin of that is probably to the nationalization of coal mines way back in 1973. We had a budget by Mr. Morarji Desai, and in one of the budgets he raised the marginal income tax to as high as 97.5%. You can't imagine that. Today when you're talking about 30% income tax rates, the marginal tax rate was raised to 97% by Morarji Desai. We had a budget by Mr. Sachin Chaudhary, and that was considered to be a washout budget. Apart from that, we have had some certain good budgets. Morarji Desai himself introduced, when the excise duty regime was so rampant, he said there must be self-assessment of excise duty, and he allowed industries to do self-assessment. That was a salutary step in its own way, because it eased a lot of administrative hurdles. We had the budget of VP Singh in 1987, where he introduced MODVAT, and that was the beginning of the whole value-added tax regime in India. We had the budget of 1986 by Rajiv Gandhi, where he introduced minimum alternative tax called MAT, and in which he said that every corporate, because there were a lot of corporates who were going scot-free without paying tax, and he introduced the whole concept of MAT. And the 3 or 4 other budgets which we remember, a lot is, of course, the epoch-making, the epochal 1991 budget of Manmohan Singh, which sort of unshackled the economy. You know, we had the import curve, the whole process of imports and exports were expanded. It was made easy for imports as well as for exports. The tax rates were reduced, and overall, there was a newfound confidence in the economy. Then we had the so-called dream budget of Chidambaram in 1997, in which he lowered the tax rates further. At that point of time, the tax collections of the government of India was 18,700 crores, which is now risen to as high as 1 lakh crores. So you can see how the lowering of tax rates that had a trigger effect on the entire economy. We had the budget of Yashwant Sinha in 2000, in which for a long time the IT sector, the software sector was sheltered and there was no tax. So he removed the sort of the incentives for the software sector in terms of the tax holiday. And a lot of people thought at that point of time that's a retrograde step. But in fact, it turned out otherwise. And the software sector today is confident. It's got its own confidence, despite the fact that the tax holiday has been removed. So these were some of the notable budgets that one can think of during the past 60, 65 years. So the budget by itself, you know, in some people might say it's just a mechanistic instrument, a mechanistic tool which sets out the revenue and the expenditure. That's a very drab way of putting it. But more importantly, the budget has a lot of socio-economic agenda. And the government, through the budget, brings out policy instruments to see how to allocate resources, how to ameliorate the poverty and the income disparities, how to control prices, and how to overall expand the growth and employment. So more than a mere mechanistic accounting instrument, it has got a lot of socio-economic agenda attached to it. Now, the current budget, I'm not getting into the current budget because the stars of today, our esteemed speakers, are going to analyze it threadbare, and the students who are going to be part of the competition are going to analyze it threadbare. But I just thought I'll make some points since I am called upon to set the tone for the day's proceedings. You know, when you look at the budget, and the last so many years that one has been following the budget, there are 4 or 5 themes that stand out. You know, and the first theme that you see every time, and especially during the last 20 years, has been this thing called growth. And we all like to say in the Indian economy is growing, we are growing at 8% or 9%. And when we get vicarious pleasure when we see that the European economies are not growing more than 2 to 2.5% or 3%, or the US economy is growing not more than 3 to 4%. But of course, we are always envious of the fact that China is growing at 10, 12 or 13%. So, but what happens is in the budget, we tend to talk about the growth, and growth per se in terms of percentages. But over the last few years, when I have been following the budget, I find that some of the absolute figures are missing. And I, for one, I fail to understand, even this budget, for instance, when you try to look at the absolute figures, what was the GDP of GDP of the country, I couldn't find out, I couldn't find it in the pages. I think our economist friends would like to say why this has been happening over the last few years. And then I had to go back into the fine print, and I found out that the tax receipts of the government of India was about 10.6% of the GDP. And somewhere in fine print they had mentioned that the tax receipts are about 10.7 lakh crore. So when you do the arithmetic, you find that the GDP of this country today is about 1 lakh crore. It's, 100 lakh crore. It's 100 lakh crore. So which means we have reached a century of 1 lakh of crore in terms of the GDP. So during a year when one of our idols has reached a century of centuries, the Indian economy has reached a century of 1 lakh of crores. So that's a very salutary impact or salutary outcome of what has been happening over the last few years. That is so much for the GDP. Now, what happens? See, which of the other themes which have been talked about in this country, and especially with the economy. The other thing which is talked about is inflation. Every budget you will find that the inflation, that the finance minister makes a mention of inflation. And in this budget, it was said that in the last quarter of this year, that has been March 2011, we have achieved a negative inflation the inflation has been negative. Now, in fine print, you will find now what really happens is in 2010, the inflation was as high as 20%. The food inflation went up to as high as 20%. And then in March 2011, it was about 9.5 to 10%. So when you now say that it is as low as 1% or even negative, it's like having battered the poor man, broken him into submission, no defense, and the poor man then you give him relief by saying that there is no inflation. When you look at it, from the viewpoint of the poor person, one really questions the way these things are presented before the public.